and it's another beautiful Sunday. How are y'all? Um, so firstly, I'm actually doing pretty good. Busy week, but I'm doing good. I'm getting a lot of things accomplished. I'm trying to clear a lot of things off my plate. Some things I've sort of contracted to do, and so I really want to get down to just my normal job and then this. Um, Outside of the other shows I do, I mean, most of the other shows are uh, they don't take up too much of my time, so that's it's not a distraction. But I've got a lot of these other projects that take away from studying for this thing, so I want to get those off my plate. Other than that, I'm doing great. I see y'all are talking, which is wonderful. Um, I'm trying to think if there's anything we need to discuss before we get into the text. Yes, actually. Um, so on Thursday, I mentioned that wormwood was a flavoring for licorice. I was incorrect on that. What happened is, unfortunately, sometimes you read something and you misremember it. So here's the truth. Um, so wormwood is actually used as a flavoring in an alcohol called absinthe. Most people haven't heard of it. It's sort of an older alcohol. It has a history of and sort of this reputation for being hallucinogenic that seems to be iffy. Uh, anyway, it was created in Sweden, actually by a woman who's just looking for something different. And wormwood is used as a flavoring, and when combined with certain other bitters and herbs, it creates a very herbaceous licorice flavor. So I apologize, I was incorrect. Wormwood is not used as a flavoring for licorice. It is, however, used or has been used medicinally for a very long time, um, as were a few other similar related plants and things like and even the plants we get licorice from were used medicinally. So that's the truth. Again, wormwood was used medicinally, but it's very bitter, right? That's sort of the whole point. Um, so I erred on that. And if I ever find that there's a problem or I make a mistake or I misspeak, I will be the first to let you know. So yeah, wormwood just means bitter. It was used as a medicine and it was used medicinally, but it tastes like licorice. And particularly in absinthe, it's processed. And yeah, absinthe is outlawed. In some places, that's actually being allowed back. Again, its reputation is sort of greater than what it really was, but that's why it was banned. Also, there were some issues with in some places with absinthe killing people because again, could be powerful if it was made incorrectly. That was sort of the problem. Again, that's with anything, right? Again, not ab. I'm not advocating the consumption of absinthe. Just stating that's there out in the universe. Just trying to be factually correct. Um, Other than that, I'm doing well. I hope y'all are doing well. If you're not able to watch us live, I hope you are watching us on recording. We are going to talk today about the Nephilim and a lot of stuff. I have this unfinished booklet that I kind of scrapped. It was what I wanted to do about the Nephilim, really kind of having that broader conversation, but so I'm actually going to get a lot of that information out of here. So if I look like it's weird, it's because I'm going to just pull it up on my screen. You can't see it, but I can see it. So I'll just get a lot of the information out of that. So if it looks like I'm reading off the screen, because I am. But I just want to make sure I get all the information correct. You will notice in the description down below, I have the two verses listed that have the actual word Nephilim used, because it's only two, but they're mentioned over 30 times. So we'll talk about that. But I also have the link to sitchinswrong.com. And it occurs to me, I haven't even checked to see if it's still up. It's one of Michael Heiser's things, or let me phrase this: Michael Heiser worked on it as well, and it's in it is that particular section is about uh, the origin of the word Nephilim, which we will get into as well. Um, so yes, let's go ahead and start with prayer. Then we'll actually, get this thing rolling. And Susan, I have no doubt that you got it from New Orleans. There's a lot of other things you get in New Orleans too, but I won't talk about that. Heavenly Father, we thank you and we praise you for all that you've done. Father, I just ask that you would bless everyone who is watching this, that you would fill their hearts and their minds with your truth, and that truth would not remain simply here, but rather would be carried on into the world. That you would work through those who watch this, that this community has an impact in the world in which they live. Father, the fields are white with harvest, and I believe that we are preparing for the final great harvest. Make us workmen who are worthy of our pay. In Christ's name I pray. Amen. So, real quick, let's actually read the only two verses in the Bible that use the word Nephilim. The first one is, of course, chapter 6. Now it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. All right, and Numbers 14:33. I'm sorry, 13:33. My bad. 13:33. This is the spies have gone over into the promised land and are coming back with a report. There we saw the giants. The descendants of Anak came from the giants. And we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. Okay. So we're going to do a lot of. Those are the only two verses that actually use the word Nephilim. And as I said earlier, if we include the references to Anak, his children, and the Anakim, the Rephites, the Rephaim, things like that, and again Goliath and his brothers, we get around 31 references to giants. Now, you could argue some of those are kind of like the same event, so maybe it's less, but roughly 30 references to these giants. Now, it's easy to say that the Nephilim and the Anak, aka the Anakim, should be connected, because that verse right there, Numbers 13:33, says the Nephilim and Anak are one and the same, right? Anak is of the Nephilim. Easy. The question, though, is what about the Rephites and the Rephaim? Are they really Nephilim? Is that sort of us incorrectly combining things? Also, what about Goliath? Is Goliath actually Nephilim? Because it doesn't say that he's Nephilim per se, nor his brothers. It just says he's very large. And how large was he actually? Was he really a giant? And should we even consider the word giant to be an accurate translation of Nephilim? And even if they were giants, are we certain that the Nephilim are the offspring of the sons of God? There's a lot of arguments here, so let me start with the last one, because that's it sets everything else off, right? So there's one argument that says that when in Genesis 6, when it says that there were giants in the earth in those days, that the Nephilim, when the sons of God came and they bore children, which were the mighty men of renown, that the Nephilim is separate from the angels and their offspring. That is one argument. I, however, disagree with that interpretation. I think it is saying the Nephilim, aka the giants, were there, And it's because of this event here that they are the offspring, they are the children. Now, we can ask, what's the best evidence for that? Well, we just saw it, right? The Anakim, or the children of Anak, which it says specifically come from the Nephilim, are giants. That seems pretty simple, right? Easy, straightforward line. But if we look to the book of Enoch, it is explicitly stated that the Nephilim, or the giants, are the offspring of the sons of God and human women. So there is the claim that the giants were sort of their own thing, and that the sons of God are the offspring of the sons of God are a different thing altogether. They're the heroes and kings that people talk about. I'm not of that opinion. And again, for those reasons. Right there in Scripture, the only other reference to Nephilim says Anak, Anakim, Nephilim, same critters. Done. But again, Book of Enoch explicitly states it and goes into a lot more detail on that. So right there, right? And of course, we can have we'll talk about the Book of Enoch in more totality later. But just so we have sort of a better reference on it, because a lot of people say, well, it's not actually of the Bible, or it's not considered canon. It was never considered canon. Well, it is considered canon in the Ethiopian texts, so I think we need to take that into consideration. But even if it's not actually canon per se, and let's say that the apostles didn't consider it canon, they sure as the world used it a lot. For example, there are 11 instances where it is either quoted directly or the Book of Enoch has influenced the text of the New Testament. For example, the best one is probably Jude 1. Well, of course, there's only Jude 1. It's Jude 14 and 15, right? We're actually quotes directly from it. But then we have 1 Corinthians 13:1, 1 Timothy 6:15, Romans 1:20, 1 Corinthians 13:1, Matthew 22:29 through 30, 2 Peter 2:11, Romans 12:3, Romans 12:6, John 1:1 through 2, Mark 14:21. But here's the thing, right? Jesus calls himself the Son of Man. That's his nom de guerre, right? His nom de voyage. Nom de plume, if you shall. A lot of French names there. The French did not like being called by their real name. Anyway, he calls himself the Son of Man, which is a direct quote from Enoch 46 and 48. Now, there's an argument to be made that he calls himself the Son of Man because of Daniel, right? There's a scene in Daniel where he says, and I saw one who looked like the Son of Man coming on clouds. Jesus does reference that verse later. And here's an interesting thing. If you go through the different translations of Daniel, it is 50-50 whether or not it says one who looks like a Son of Man or the Son of Man. And the reason for it is Hebrew doesn't have the Hebraic versions do not have a definitive article there. So it's ambiguous at best. However, so a lot of that is, again, why would people choose a versus the? Well, if you look at the text, it is identical to when Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego are in the flames, and they look at it and say, I see one who looks like a son of the gods. That's what Nebuchadnezzar says. It's the exact same phraseology, right? So it says Son of Man for Daniel. So it really should be a. But the theological interpretation says, well, Jesus is quoting Daniel at his trial. Therefore, that's where he gets his name. Therefore, it should be the definitive article of the. That is not an inaccurate. That's not let me phrase this. I don't disagree with that interpretation per se. The problem is, it also implies then that Daniel knew of the Book of Enoch and had read it. Here's why. In the Book of Enoch, the Son of Man is presented before him. It's a very messianic section, right? If you want to understand why a lot of these other things reference it, go read that section. It is remarkably messianic. You'd be like, this looks like it belongs in the New Testament. And the Son of Man is presented as the Messiah figure. He's the one who's going to come. He's going to break the teeth of the wicked, things like that. So it is when Jesus asked people, who asked Peter, who do you say the Son of Man is? He's obviously, we always read this, he's talking about himself, and he is. What he's actually doing is asking him, when you read through Jude, essentially when you read through Enoch, not Jude, when you read through Enoch, it talks about the Son of Man. Who do you think that is? And when he says he is the Son of God, he's like, no one's told you that. That was revealed to you by the Holy Spirit, right? So either way, even if Daniel is using the definitive article, he looks like the Son of Man, meaning the Messiah, then that means the Book of Enoch existed in some form while Daniel was still around. If he's using the more passive or the a Son of Man, and then the reason Jesus uses the definitive article of the is because he's combining the concepts. He's saying the Son of Man that Daniel saw is the Son of Man from Enoch, and I'm the dude. So there we go. But the broader point is, even you don't have to take the Book of Enoch to be canon scripture in order to understand that it has a profound impact on the New Testament and on the New Testament writers. In fact, Paul makes a ton of sense. All of the things we fight over on what Paul meant and what he's talking about goes away if you actually understand what is taught in the Book of Enoch. So there we have it. So again, Numbers makes it clear that the sons of Anak are giants, and that the sons of Anak are from the Nephilim. Therefore, the Nephilim are giants. Now, this sort of comes into the next question of, but do they mean giants as in physical giants, or do these giants mean something else? Like, do they mean fallen ones? Maybe they're only politically giant. Like, we call people who are powerful today, or people who have great impacts on our society, giants, right? Not an unknown thing. So it could be that they were looking at the achievements, right? In fact, a lot of archaeologists. I was just watching. While I was working, I had the Naked Archaeologist playing in the background. They have all of his shows on YouTube now. So even if you don't have Amazon Prime, you can go to YouTube, look at Naked Archaeologist. I think it's Syndicato TV is the group that has it. But yeah, you can watch all this stuff. I love watching his work. I don't agree with all of his conclusions, particularly on the matter of the Nephilim. But it is a great show, and he does a really good job of breaking down a lot of archaeology and sort of saying, hey, a lot of times the problem isn't with the text. The problem is with our reading of the text. We impose things on the text, and then we take it as if that was real. And then when we look like, well, that doesn't look like what I thought it was, therefore the text is wrong. And he's like, whoa. Let's actually read the text, and let's work from the text, and then let's actually look at what we find, and we find that it actually lines up better. It's just the problem is sometimes our assumptions are wrong and our preconceived notions are wrong. And I was going somewhere with that. Where was I going to? Oh well. If you haven't seen them, go watch them. It's great. Oh, Nephilim, like fallen upon or fallen away, right? That's so. Again, Heiser, right? I'm trying to pull up the text so I can be real precise on this one, because it is not. Here we are. Language is not my strong suit. I am lucky to speak English. I admit that wholeheartedly. My wife, when she was not my wife, tried to teach me Spanish for college. She was my tutor. I was happy to get away with a C, and to this day, I can only order a taco. I can find the bathroom. I can find the library. And I can order a beer. So unless I'm trying to order a taco and a beer from a library that has a bathroom, I'm pretty much out. Like I'm done. But which is why I like to look at people who have a better understanding, like Michael Heiser. The man is a genius, and he is a Semiticist, so he's not just a linguist. He studies the culture. He's putting things in broader context. I highly recommend his writings. I do, and even if you don't have time, maybe to read his writings, he has a ton of stuff on YouTube. He's done a million interviews. I mean, he puts all of this stuff out there. Go listen to the guy. His work on the Divine Council is inspired. It really is. Um, because again, one of the things that I would like to do in this channel is have that higher, more in-depth conversation. I think we as Christians are ill served by this. Well, this is what it says in the English text, and this is how I'm interpreting it from a modern American perspective. Therefore, that's what the text means, and that's all there should be. Here's your bumper sticker. Have a good day. That's We need to be interacting with the text, and we need to understand that it was written in a context that's very foreign to us, and we need to try and get into that original mindset so we can glean more out of it, particularly in the original text. As we've pointed out in the past, even the very letters of Hebrew have other meanings, and you can. One of the things we're going to do here on the Thursday show coming up is we're going to go through when it lists the names of the tribes. Again, we'll probably do it in the wrap up. We're going to notice that there is a message hidden within the names. So, just a little thing there. But the point being, the Bible is having a very large and broad conversation, and we need to be having one as well. So so we've already agreed that okay, Nephilim are the children of the angels. They are giants, but should we really be reading Nephilim as giant, meaning physically tall, or could it mean something else? A lot of people have pointed to it's not Sitchin who originated this idea, but he did popularize it, particularly amongst the UFO ancient alien crowd, right? Which is that Nephilim actually means the fallen ones, or meaning some have even said, those who've come from heaven, which means they then combine the Nephilim in the sense of God is the same thing. But Heiser has a better observation because the Hebrew language does not have a J in it. It's more of a Y sound, so it's not Jehovah. It's Yehovah. Some will say Yahweh. I think I tend to go with the Yehovah pronunciation for a number of reasons. I think we've already talked about it. If not, we'll talk about it later. So the argument is that the word Nephilim comes from Nephal, right, which means fallen ones, or it means to fall, and then Nephilim would be the fallen ones. But the problem is the way it's sort of conjugated out, right? And they're like, it wouldn't be if Nephilim couldn't start from Nephal. Basically, is the best way to think of it this way. So other languages, it's not just like where we'll do weird things with it, but some languages just create a whole new word, but there's the root word and you can kind of see it in there. But the thing is, Nephal wouldn't conjugate out to Nephilim. It would be more like Nephilim. So it would be a very different word. Because and even then, it couldn't mean those who fall or those who fall away, meaning those who fall away from God, as has been argued from the Sethite theory that the Nephilim are the sons of God, or are the Sethites that had fallen away and out of grace. That would be, Heiser points out that would be sort of conjugated out as Noph Elim. So the question is, what is the root word for Nephilim as we know it? Since we only have the two occurrences of that word, it's ambiguous. But he points out that there is a noun called in Aramaic, it's Nephil, and it does exist, and in that word means giant. So there is a noun in a related language that means giant. And so his argument is, again, Moses is writing in a language that people at the time could understand, so they knew what a giant was. They knew they had that word Nephil as giant. So Nephilim, meaning giants or the giant ones, makes better sense. So that is Heiser's argument on that, and we use that as a way of saying, uh, "Oh, hey, Tex." Um, so and that is sort of a similarly backed up by the Septuagint, which translates Nephilim as giants or gigantus in the Greek. So right there we have from where where the word would have come from, what the actual noun is, to how the Greeks translate it. It's very clear that Nephilim are physical giants. It's not a metaphorical thing. These are physical giants. Now, another argument that pops up, and I see this a lot in the Christian community, is that, okay, but the sons of God aren't actually angels. They're, again, it's a Sethite theory that they are they're children of Seth who have fallen and they're mating with the children of Cain. Okay. Before I even attack their argument from that they will use from the New Testament, I'd like to point one thing out from Genesis itself. All right. Let's just use the actual verse itself to say, does that make any sense at all before I even begin to address the chaos of what people do when they go to the New Testament to claim that this must be Sethites, because it is nuts. Again, chapter 6, verse 1. Now it came to pass when men, human beings, began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men. Okay, so here's the deal. We have two very clear delineations happening, and it says we have the sons of God and the daughters of men. Literally in the Hebrew, Bene Elohim, or sons of God, or sons of the gods, depending how you wanted to translate that, which we would go with God because there's only one. And then we have literally Bath Adama, or the children of Adam, or the children of the. It could even be rendered as children of Earth. That, in fact, that's sort of the other way we could read that text, is because, again, Adam means earth, right? It also means man. So you could have read that as the children, and even if you take Elohim, not necessarily to mean God specifically, but just the supernatural spirit, because we do see Elohim also used when Saul goes to the Witch of Endor and Samuel is pulled up and the spirit of Samuel appears. That's used. So Elohim does not only mean God. It really means more divine or spiritual beings. So what we're saying is the sons of spiritual beings, meaning that realm, and then the daughters of the earth. That verse could very easily be translated in those two lines. So even right there in the text, there is no way you could argue that the sons of God somehow mean the sons of Seth, and that the daughters of men actually mean the daughters of Cain. If that was what was meant, Moses would have written that. All throughout the rest of the Pentateuch, we see the sons of this dude, and the sons of this dude, and the sons of this dude, and the sons. There was absolutely no reason. There is no textual reason to look at that verse and say, Moses doesn't mean angels. What he means is other humans. So, that having been said, let's walk through the argument that is made from the New Testament, which was written, over 1,000 years later. Let's see if I can find the section. I've got it here. So here's the thing. I am actually going to use a lot of the stuff I'm reading out of this. Once I'm done getting caught up in everything, and I have this book coming out in the fall, once I'm done promoting that, I am going to do at least one more sort of final big push to write a book and do like an actual video that I will put out, like not just on this channel, but like on Amazon Prime, things like that. That's sort of a whole. It's a biblical worldview, creation, the giants, cryptozoology, forbidden archaeology, UFOs, the end times, all is one big, complete story. Because I think that's sort of the problem is we divide a lot of these things up and we don't see the bigger picture. That's the reason any of the, in fact, we're going to point out the entire reason I'm doing this is because this matters. And we're going to get to that at the end. So if we go a little long, I do apologize. But I want to walk through all this because this is important to understand literally the rest of the Bible and the book of Revelation. So, okay, so basically there are two verses that when people say that angels, so the argument is the New Testament makes the definitive claim that angels cannot possibly have children. And therefore, Genesis must therefore be talking about Sethites who had fallen, because as we know, in the New Testament, we are called sons of God. Therefore, those who follow God are sons of God, and those who follow the ways of evil or wickedness are the sons of man. Okay, let's start with whether or not angels can have children. The first verse on this they point to is Luke 20:34 through 36, which says, "And Jesus answering said unto them, The children of this world marry and are given in marriage, but they which shall be accounted worthy to obtain that world and the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage. Neither can they die anymore, for they are equal unto the angels and are the children of God, being the children of the resurrection." Okay, they will say right there, angels can't have children. Well, okay, hold on. Firstly, it doesn't say they can't. It says that they don't, right? But let's actually take a look at the parallel passage in Matthew, which is 22:3, right? "For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels of God in heaven." That last section is what's important. They do not marry, but are as the angels of God in heaven. Why wouldn't he just say as the angels? Why would he say the angels of God in heaven? Because if you take the book of Enoch seriously, if you take Genesis 6 seriously, you understand that the Watcher class angels, the 200 that fell, created Nephilim, they left their first estate. They were no longer in heaven. They came to earth to rule mankind and to have these children, which they did. Which means they are no longer of God, right? Because they left their first estate, as Jude himself says. Jude was the half-brother of Jesus. And he flat out says, and again, Jude, the half-brother of Jesus, right, he's writing this one letter, and he focuses a lot, and he ties a lot into this event that's described very fully in the book of Enoch, which he quotes. So we can't deny that. So Jesus himself is saying, as the angels of God in heaven. Who were the Watchers? They left their first estate, meaning they're no longer of God, they are fallen, and they came to earth, meaning they are not in heaven. In fact, where are they now? They're in Tartarus. Peter confirms this, and we'll talk about that at the end. So, right there, Jesus does not say that angels can't have children. He says that the angels who of God, who have retained their estate, that are in heaven, do not have children. In fact, that's the entire point of Jude, is that the ones who left their estate, right, they rejected God, they rejected where they're supposed to be, and they did that evil act. The second verse that is often used, right, is when Jesus is talking to Nicodemus, right? And it's John 3:6, where he says, "That which is born of the flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the spirit is spirit." And they say, see, angels are spirits, therefore they can't have children that are of flesh. Again, two big problems with this verse. One, Jesus is talking to Nicodemus about the regeneration of our souls, right? That's the entire context. This was not some in-depth treaty on the relationship between angels and reality, or supernatural beings in the material world. It was about us as human beings. And he's explaining the act of the regeneration of our spirit, because we were born of flesh. That's us. This sexiness right here is the flesh, right? We were born physically, but we need to be reborn spiritually. That's the entire point. It has zip to do with angels. Now, let's take it one more step. So not only does the New Testament not say anything about angels not being able to have children, the last half of this argument, that anyone who is called a son of God is because they follow God, is theologically abhorrent. Here, let me explain why. The entire point of the New Testament is that Jesus' sacrifice allows us to be reborn into into the family of God. That's how we become sons of God and daughters of God, is that we are being reborn into this family and we are adopted. That could not occur in the Old Testament. If it could occur in the Old Testament, there would have been no reason for Jesus to even come and pay for our sins. The Old Testament, they were friends of God. They were followers of God. They were righteous. They were the elect. They're still part of the church. It is Jesus's sacrifice that allows them into heaven, right? Because their faith was on what was about to happen. Our faith is what is happened, and we are now regenerated of spirit to become sons of God. That is a strictly New Testament phraseology. It is not something that occurs in the Old Testament, and it certainly does not occur in the Pentateuch. Again, the Pentateuch, which was written 1,000 years before the New Testament, had to be understandable to the people that it was written to. Does everything in there have to be understood by them? No, of course not. There are things that were for us later. But it had to make sense, at least in the broader context within their culture. Going from something literally 1,000 years later that is only possible after Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, is to essentially say that to say that it applies in Genesis, is that Jesus' resurrection is irrelevant. Is to say that his sacrifice is irrelevant. Because we could have become sons of God some other way. And that is an error. Adam is called a son of God. Yes. Why? Because he didn't have any other father. That's the point. Son of. Who made you? That's the entire concept, right? Where do you come from? Adam's is a son of God because God's the one who made him. God's the one who made him. Every other human being is a son of Adam because Adam, through Eve, obviously, made everyone else. We're all sons of Adam. We are metaphorically sons of Cain. Again, that's a theological argument because we know that Cain's line was wiped out with the flood. But spiritually we are. So again, the Sethite theory, I would argue this is one of the few times I will say is a heresy. Because in order to make the argument that the Sethite theory, now that doesn't mean you're not saved. It's not even necessarily something I would break communion over, but it is a heresy because you have to twist and manipulate the Bible so dramatically to come to that conclusion that you are not actually reading the Bible at that point. I think we can all read the Bible and be honest brokers and have different perspectives and even different conclusions. That's fine. But to come to the conclusion that the Nephilim are the sons of Sethites who fell and left their left their their godliness and started hitting the gin joints where Cain's daughters were hanging out, to read that into the text is to literally just it is a textual gymnastic that would require surgery to correct. So I'm of the opinion that is absolutely a heresy. Tex asks a great question on that. Why did the views change? So this is an argument that actually goes back a long way, and here's why. It comes down to the fact that some people do not. I want to be generous on this one because I'm a naturally generous guy, and then that may be my biggest. Honestly, that may be my biggest failing. I'm starting to see that, particularly with all the stuff that's going on, but we'll talk about that later. Being generous, I think the problem is a lot of people looked around and said, well, I don't see any giants. There are no giants hanging around. Maybe this is more metaphorical. And again, they said, well, angels are spirits. They can't, so spirits can't have kids. And so this must mean something else. And this is not a recent thing. Again, by new, this goes back almost over 1,500 years. We see church fathers, Julius Africanus, I believe, and a few others who held to this position. So this is an old position that Sethites, again, this heresy that Sethites are the fathers of the Nephilim. It's an old heresy. But again, it goes back to when you start trying to understand the world around the Bible from this, right? When you try to understand the world from what you see instead of what's actually written down, you're going to be led astray every single time. So the Nephilim, so just to recap very quickly, they are clearly giants. The word does mean giant. They are connected to the Anak and the Anakim. We can connect them to the Rephites, because again, Og, king of Bashan, was massive. They are the sons of angels. They are not the sons of Seth. So and angels can have kids. So that's where we're at right now. How tall were these giants? Because the Book of Enoch says that they were, some people will say they were over a mile tall. Well, let's be honest, if that's the case, then those guys weren't having kids with human beings. And that certainly is not the height that we see post-flood. So how tall were they? This is where I think the Book of Enoch can not necessarily be held out at arm's length, but we need to recognize that we may not have a pure version of it. However, there is an argument to be made that the L that is meant, so it talks about how there are like 2,000 L's, I believe, or 3,000 L's. The problem is that we believe that word L is often said, well, that means an L and a cubit are the same thing. Not always. Measurements are an interesting thing. Each culture has its own measurement, right? And things that we think of as one thing can often be very different. For example, even within the Jewish culture, the cubit had different standards, and they would change from period to period, right? Every king tried to. I could work blue, but I'm not. They wanted to show their greatness by having the biggest cubit, right? All right, we all know why. So that fluctuated, but there's a lot of arguments. Let me pull up the section on the best numbers, right? Because I tried to figure out Goliath, right? Because Og is said to be, just absolutely massive. Like he's 9 cubits tall, and no matter which cubit you use, that's well outside the range of human beings. But the question becomes, well, what size or what cubit is used by Moses, right? That's important because there is some archaeological evidence to be argued that the cubit used by Moses was actually half, almost basically around a foot long, like 11 something. So everything that Moses would have written about would have actually been significantly smaller than we think. However, it's entirely possible that they were using a larger cubit as well. Again, this is where things get convoluted and complicated, and until we find the actual Ark of the Covenant, I don't know that we're actually going to know what cubit Moses used. But there is an interesting discrepancy between the Septuagint and the Masoretic text. We're actually going to talk. I'm going to have a friend on, and over a couple Saturdays, we're going to talk about the Septuagint and its origins. But suffice it to say, there are some differences in between the Septuagint and the Masoretic text. The Masoretic text is the official Hebrew translation or Hebrew version of the Old Testament. And it's what most Bibles are based on today. However, the Septuagint um, gives a different measurement for, amongst these differences are a different measurement for Goliath. Masoretic says he was 6 cubits in a span, and the Septuagint says he was 4 cubits in a span. Well, that's kind of a big difference, right? And if you use that the cubit that is being stated in those verses is only 18 inches, then Goliath goes from being a giant to being a slightly above average dude, right? So how do we rectify this? Long story short, I kind of looked at it and I had a theory, because the weights of the armor doesn't change. And that was sort of my clue, right? It's like, well, hold on. The Septuagint says it was 4. This one says it's 6. But if they were changing, if let's say the Masoretic text, because I do believe the Masoretic text was changed in 90 AD and maybe even before then to try and argue against Christianity. Again, long story on that one. But if they were changing the size of Goliath to make David's act appear more heroic, right? If that's it's sort of some ancient propaganda, then they would have changed the weight of his armor as well, but they didn't. Which means that was sort of my clue, because I'm thinking, well, the only reason you change that then is if you're trying to standardize something, right? So my thought was the people working from the Greek, or even from the Masoretic text, right? What they were doing is they said, okay, hold up. As the rabbis, because the rabbis had information that we don't have today, they have stories and traditions. They may have said, well, hold on, we know that this cubit was used for Moses and them, and we all teach that. And then we have these cubits over here. We have the Ptolemaic cubit, we have this cubit. Why don't we just standardize everything so everyone knows it's the same measurement? So that made a lot of sense to me. So I went back and I looked at all the different official cubits I could find, right? So like the standard Hebraic cubit is between 17 and a half and 18 inches, right? Sort of like the Roman cubit. That's what everyone knows about. But then you had what was called the short cubit, which was an older version. That was actually 20.24 inches. Then you had the long cubit, aka the royal cubit, and that was 0.888 inches long. But then you also had the Hashemite, or the sacred cubit, which was 25.1 inches long. And here's the thing: that sacred cubit that number shows up in a lot of architectural and archaeological sites around the world. So it's entirely possible that Moses is using that larger number. And there are other numbers mentioned, right, in some of these other cubits that pop up. It can range from as high as 27.16 inches to even 31.24 inches. So we have a lot of things. So for Goliath, what I did was I looked at the arm. Okay, I'm going to sort of jump through all the math here. I took the weight of his armor and compared it to the type of armors that were worn by the Canaanites at the time, right? And there were two different things that they could have been. One is a full shirt, as far as the male armor goes. One could have been one that goes actually down to like his knees. So it could have been like a full-blown tunic, or it could have just been a shirt. And I looked at the average weight of those things versus the average weight, on a soldier the average Canaanite soldier is about 5'3", the average weight in percentages. And so what I found was there was a height range using Shaquille O'Neal and Dirk Nowitzki as sort of a ratio, right? Because the bigger you get, the heavier you get. So I kind of used, but the thing is, like, Shaq is a monster, right? You compare him with Dirk Nowitzki. Dirk is very lean. Shaq, at his prime, again, they're both just a little over 7 feet tall, but Shaq in his prime was a monster. Like, when you compare their weights, you're like, whoa, two very different things are happening here. So I kind of hybridize the size weight ratio for them, and figure out, like, for every so many feet high, your weight has to go up, because you have to have bones to be Your bones have to be a certain thickness to hold up, and your muscle mass has to be a certain percentage to do heavy activity. Like the tallest man on record was Robert Wadlow. He was only like 8 feet 11 inches. I say only, obviously in comparison to the giants. But the dude needed a cane to get around, and he was very young when he started needing help. All of these people that you see who are giants in today's day, that's due to a pituitary gland issue, they are not healthy people. And this is not a condemnation. It's obviously not a moral condemnation. They are sick. I feel very bad for them. I mean, they live very short lives because it is an illness that they are suffering from. But they are so big that their own bodies really can't support their weight. Oftentimes, you'll see them using crutches or canes to get around because their bodies just can't hold up. These are not people who are, you would be like, here's a giant spear, here's 100+ pounds of armor, go fight somebody. I'm sorry, Robert Wadlow would have been the most ineffectual charioteer in the history of the world. He wouldn't have had the strength to fight, much less the endurance to do ancient combat, right? So I look at someone like, say, Shaquille O'Neal and Dirk Nowitzki because they're athletes. They are healthy for their size. So we kind of, and I was able to take that, compare it to an average soldier, again, height weight ratio kind of thing, create a ratio. So depending on whether or not that the weight of his armor is either a shirt or a full tunic, right? It becomes, so once you do that, right? There were two numbers that show up, or two groups of numbers that showed up. One's about 9.5 inches. The other one's about 30. Well, the other one's I'm sorry, for Goliath. Hold on, was 11. Where did I put him? Yeah, 11 feet, almost 10 inches. Those are the two ranges that I got from the shirts. And then I checked. I'm like, are there two sets of numbers? Again, exactly. That's why the Big Show had surgery. Andre the Giant died because of his, again, being that large is not, for a human, is just not healthy. It is not normal. We're not meant to be that big. So that's why these giants, you see Goliath running around. He is in full armor and he is battling people, and people are terrified of this guy. I mean, these were not pansies, right? The Jews were not, the ancient Israelites, they were not pansies. These were people to be feared. And yet they looked at him and said, yeah, I don't want any part of that, right? So that tells you this was not Robert Wadlow. This was not some very thin, frail, stumbling around kind of guy. This was an active, vicious, effective warrior. So if you look at the weight of his armor, he's either, and again, I found two sets of cubits that would have been used. Again, between the standard cubit and the I think the sacred cubit. They match up perfectly with the height rate ratio for the armor matches up perfectly with those measurements. So Goliath was either 9.5 feet tall or 11.9 or 11 feet 10 inches. That's it. Period. He is, depending on which cubit, whether they're switching from one cubit to the other, right? He was a monster. There's absolutely no way that Goliath is, and it could be considered a human with a pituitary gland issue. He was well outside the range of any human we've ever seen before, period. And he was effective. That means he is not a pituitary gland issue. So how tall were the giants? Well, to be honest, he seems to be the smallest one on record, because Og is even larger than that. He could be as tall as 18 feet. Again, if you use that larger royal cubit, Og could have been closer to 18 feet tall, which brings me back to the book of Enoch, the 3,000 ells, right? If an ell is 18 inches, then yeah, these things are a mile long. But there is a Talmudic reference to there being a smaller ell that was only a finger tall. It was like measuring in centimeters, right? we have to understand that sometimes the issue is not in the text; it's in our understanding of the text. If we think that the Book of Enoch is saying that they were a mile tall, that's one thing. But if we realize that there's another number to be used and we use it, it's 2 point something, I think it's 2.2 centimeters, then those 3,000 ells, the giants become 20 feet tall, give or take. Well, that's almost 1-to-1 with what we see for the royal or the sacred cubit and Og, the king of Bashan, who's a post-flood giant. They were a little bit taller, but not so outlandishly much taller that we couldn't believe it. Because remember, everything post-flood is smaller, right? There were giant teratorns and giant armadillos and giant everything. Everything in pre-flood was much larger. But then you get post-flood and everything's smaller. Well, why wouldn't the giants be smaller? And by the way, something that Sir Flinders Petrie, the man who literally wrote the book on Egyptology, he noted that he found a race of giants in his writings, that they lived in and amongst the Egyptians. They were a completely different culture, but they did have some interactions. He said that they averaged over 8 feet tall, but they were their own group of people. They averaged over 8 feet tall, and they had their own little unique material culture. There were a ton of stories of Spanish explorers and conquistadors running across, particularly North America, tribes of what they called Indians that were 8 feet tall or taller. The American Indians, they all have stories of these massive giants using lances to impale like 3 braves at a time. Well, we found a bronze. At first, people thought it was a sword. Then they realized, no, it's a lance head. And guess how much it weighed? 7.5 pounds. How much did Goliath's spear point weigh? 7.5 pounds. And that right there even goes back to show how tall and powerful Goliath had to be, because a spear point is usually a third or a quarter of the weight of the overall lance or spear. And this is across every culture. You can find, if you look around, I have found and explored the heaviest spears, and yet no matter who you talk to, whether it's Europeans, Asians, Africans, the Americans, every culture, those spear points usually are only either a third or a quarter the weight of the overall spear. Why? Because the human being has to use it, right? Most swords are only like 1.5 pounds, 2 pounds, 3 pounds. Even a claymore is like the biggest claymores you can find is only 5 pounds. It takes a lot of strength to wield these things, right? For like, well, it's only 5 pounds. You try hacking at people for 2, 3, 4 hours with a 5-pound sword, and you tell me how much of a workout that is. One of the things that always surprised me is how, like, I would spar when I was in fighting shape, and I would spar. You'd spar for 20, 30 minutes with a bunch of different people with breaks in between. You'd be exhausted. We're not talking, and that's not running out and fighting in armor with weapons that weigh a couple pounds, and you're bashing somebody's skull as hard as you can. Spears tend to only weigh like 7 pounds max, and that's the entire spear point and shaft. So if the spear point itself, right, is over 7.5 pounds, that means that the beam, Larry calls it a weaver's beam, but that means the shaft for that spear point could have weighed 21 pounds. I mean, just the shaft alone could have weighed as much as 21 or 28 pounds. And then you have another 7 pounds stop. I mean, this is a 30-pound weapon. That's not light. That is a huge, huge hunk of wood to be handling around. So clearly Goliath is physically impressive, even though he is not called a Nephilim specifically in the text. We do know he comes from Gath. Gath is sort of connected to the Rephites, so he's clearly from the Nephilim, but he's also the smallest one on record. And yeah, we can go through, we can find all kinds to Texas Point. Um, yeah, Captain LaFleur, there's a story that they fought these bands of brothers who all of them were over 7 feet tall. Again, you have the Lovelock cave giants, which were supposedly cannibals, like the Nephilim of Enoch, who were also cannibals. The Lovelock giants supposedly had red hair. We can hear a lot of stories of giants having red hair. It doesn't bode well for my genetic lineage. Um, but yeah, they were supposed to be over 7 8 feet tall as well. So there is. So again, it does seem like the closer to modernity we get, the giants get smaller. But it does look like okay. Well, the youngest was 6'11", but the point is that's still okay. Well, that throws everything out the window. The point is they were tall people, exceptionally tall people. But does that mean that they were necessarily giants? I don't know. But what we do know is that there are plenty of stories of multi-fingered, polydactyl humans of immense size. These are all descendants of the Nephilim. So so here's where everything sort of comes to the conclusion for me, right? So what? We're an hour in, and what have we proven? The Bible talks about giants. They are the offspring of angels. So what? I mean, that and the $1.50, well, $7.50 will buy you a latte at Starbucks, right? Which is why I don't go there. I don't drink coffee. So what is the importance of this? What does it matter to us? That's the important question. Because if this was just some interesting thing in the Bible's like, hey, here's this interesting thing, and then you put it, you'll feather, and you're happy, you move on. Okay, that's a value, I suppose. I mean, there's a lot of things like that. But what is the broader takeaway? Why is this so important that I've spent the first hour of an hour-long show or Bible study? I don't even know what to call this, because like the Thursday nights of the Bible studies, we'll come up with a word for this. But for our Sunday morning meeting, I've spent the first hour, and I'm going to go long, of an hour-long broadcast, just proving that the text is very clear that there were giants. They were the offspring of angels and humans, and then of course they created their own genetic lineage. They were on the earth prior to the flood and after. Of what significance is this? Since they're probably gone, right? Two things, very important. Firstly, in First Peter, I realized I had the whole thing pulled up in the text. Hold on. Instead of digging through my Bible to pull it up, I could have just read it off off the file I had. I'm not. Let it never be said that I'm a brilliant man, because I am clearly not. Because I make stupid things like that, right? And yes, the giant of Kandahar that has been rumored to exist, right? That was they claimed he was 14 or 15 feet tall. Again, we don't know, right? I would like to think the giant of Kandahar happened, but again, we don't have proof, so we just kind of have to put that story out there and say, well, it is not inconsistent with what we know of Nephilim, right? But do we know that it happened? We don't know. But it is an interesting story. Okay, so here's the importance. The importance and why we spent so much time on this. The first element, right, is found in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4, where it says, God did not hold back from punishing the angels that sinned by throwing them into Tartarus. Some translations read hell, but Tartarus is actually the word that was used. He cast them into Tartarus, delivered them to pits of dense darkness to be reserved for judgment. Why is that important, right? Well, this is very clearly referencing the angels, the 200 watchers that fell. The first 199 were chained in the depths of the earth. They were trapped in Sheol, but there's a different level, which is why we'll get to that in a second. So they were chained, and then Azazel, who I believe is one of the Satans, I'm just going to throw that out there. We'll talk about that later. He was chained in the wilderness, or Dudael. He is the demon, or not the demon. He is the spirit that sin was to be placed on. So when they would send out the scapegoat, right? They chose the two goats, one to sacrifice, one to send out for the scapegoat. The scapegoat we render scapegoat actually means goat for Azazel. That is its name. They would tie the cord and send him out in the, to the sin. That is, I believe, the spirit that Jesus spoke to when he was in the wilderness for his temptation. I think that I'm of the opinion that it's entirely possible that Azazel is Satan. Again, I'm not going to say that absolutely with ontological certitude, but I think that he is, if he's not the Satan, he's a Satan. Just think. But for the other 199, they were cast within the earth, within Sheol, right? But they were reserved in a certain spot, which is what Peter calls Tartarus. The importance of that we'll come to in a second. But here's the easiest thing to think of. Sheol, right, is the land of the dead. It's not hell as we think of hell. Hell isn't open yet. Hell is actually the lake of fire, right? So why are they in Sheol? Think of Sheol as a Chili's. It's the Chili's of the afterlife, right? You got a non-smoking section, you got a smoking section, and then within that smoking section, there's the bar. When you get there, if you're one of the righteous dead, you were sent to Abraham's bosom, which is paradise, right? If you were unrighteous, you went to the righteous is the non-smoking section. The unrighteous dead went to the smoking section, and the angels that sin are trapped in Tartarus, which is the bar, right? That's where they're chained. In fact, I forget his name. There's a guy who wrote 23 Minutes in Hell. I really recommend the book. I'd say by the time he's had his encounter, he talks about it a little bit. Pretty much everything after that is just him dealing with it. You can kind of skip through that. But that first half or 2/3 is amazing. So, long story short, Jesus takes a gentleman to hell where he is allowed to experience a fraction of hell. And he even recognized that he could see things. He's like, I know it's weird that I can see things because there was this oppressive darkness, but he could see it. And basically what happened is Jesus was there. He was just allowing him to sort of experience a fraction of it so that he would become a preacher. It's most of the, if you read through most people who start a lot of the great awakenings in this country, they had most of the greatest evangelists had a very profound understanding of hell. But he discusses these 8-foot, 9-foot, 10-foot tall reptilian creatures that he calls demons that are sort of roaming free, just trying to enact their anger upon people. But then he talks about these massive things that look like spiders chained to the wall. Like there were pits, and then there were these individual pits within hell. But then he looked up, and there was this sort of chasm, and there were these creatures chained to the wall. That's, that is, those are the Watchers. Again, as we talked about on Thursday, I believe that personally, again, not saying it as absolute fact, just my opinion, my reading, is that the locusts of the pit from Revelation are the Watchers, that they are released, right? Because as we see in the book of Enoch, they are chained for 70 generations. They're chained for the time of the end. They are released, right? Michael releases, in Daniel 12, he ceases from restraining them because Michael is the restrainer. He's not, hey, Daniel, I'll see you later tonight. He is, he ceases from restraining the Watchers, and that's who the locusts are. But the importance here is that Peter is referring to this place where these Watchers were cast as Tartarus. Why is that important? To the Greeks, Tartarus is the location that the Titans were imprisoned by the Olympians, right? So, real quick on the Greek history, there was a primordial god who goes unnamed. That's who Paul talks about, right? When he says, hey, there's the statue to this unknown god. If you read the Hesiod's Theogony, it says flat out that there is a creator god that the Greeks did not have a name for. He's the one who brings the earth out of chaos. But then you have the next generation sort of gods, and then monsters like the 100-armed Cyclops and all that. But you had the Titans, right? These were the primordial gods, Kronos, Gaia, a bunch of others. Well, they are overthrown eventually by their children, who lock them in Tartarus, right? So when Peter says that these angels that God, that sin, that God is punished by throwing them into Tartarus, he's saying the Titans and the angels are the same beings. It's the same story, which also means that their children, the Nephilim, are the Olympian gods. Peter's entire point here is all of these stories that we see in our culture, right, or from Peter's perspective, from the Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, all of these things are remnants of what happened both in prehistory, right, in prior to the flood, but then immediately after as well with Nimrod. And we're going to talk about Nimrod and how the Nephilim return maybe on a different day. Actually, it's probably going to be very much tied into the Thursday night Bible study, so be there for that one then. TARDIS. No. Tartarus. Text. Tartarus. Anyway. Doctor Who references. So, Peter is telling us that all of the world's religions, these quote unquote pagan religions, they are actually remembering these stories. They have, it's a history of these other creatures. Well, why is that important? Because he's confirming kind of something that the rabbis who translated the Hebrew text into Greek the first time, which is the Septuagint, right? The word shadim, which are the demons, right? That they worshipped. They use the term demon, which is a Greek word. Well, the demons are the spirits of what the Greeks considered the golden people, right? In Greek history, philosophy, mythology, they believed that there was this golden age a long time ago, and there were these golden, perfect people. They literally called them the golden people, so it's called the golden age. They died, right? And then their spirits became demons. They teach you knowledge. That's what they do, is they come to people and sometimes you could be possessed by them, and they would give you prophecies. They would give you knowledge. That was their main things. They were a teacher of knowledge. So when the Jewish rabbis are translating the Bible into, at least the Old Testament, into Greek, they said, "Hey guys, this is the same thing, right? They think these things are fun, cuddly, wisdom-teaching creatures. We're telling you they ain't. These are the disembodied spirit of the Nephilim, right? They died. They became demons, or, shadim. It's one and the same. To the Greeks, they're the demons. To us, they're the shadim. They're one and the same. So they're tying everything together. Well, Peter's doing the same thing. He is saying, hey, guys, these titans are these titan creatures that the Greeks are talking about. That's actually the angels that fell, that created the Nephilim, which means all of these other mythologies are simply stories of the Nephilim, right? They've been changed and worked around a little bit, and probably the stories themselves are false, but the basic idea is this mythology. It's more about who are they worshiping. What they are worshiping are demons. That is his whole point. And we have to remember, what were the Nephilim? What do we see them doing? They're cannibals. And we see that in the post-flood world. Every time these things show up, these Nephilim show up, they are cannibals. But there's another issue, and here's why, the second point, why these things are important. I'm going to read a quote to you from, I always forget who it is. Richard Dawkins, there it is. There's a number of prominent atheists. And in his book, The God Delusion, he says, the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction, jealous and proud of it. A petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty, ethnic cleansing, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, but capriciously malevolent bully. And the primary reason that or the primary evidence that Dawkins uses to support this claim is the flood and the cleansing of the Levant. So here's the problem. If you do not understand who and what the Nephilim are, right? If you do not understand what they do, then this quote makes a lot of sense. Usually, when people, I was raised hearing, well, the reason for the flood and the reason for the cleansing of the Levant is you can't really question it because it's God's will and God's always right. I mean, that's an argument to be made. But the thing is, the God of the Old Testament is very much like, sit down, let's reason one to another. He doesn't want you to follow him blindly. That's why he writes so much about wisdom through his prophets and through his poets. This is a God who wants us, in the same God of the of the New Testament, he wants us to be with him. He wants us to understand him. He wants us to understand that right is right, not just because he made it right, but because there's an objective standard of right and wrong that he said, here it is. And that he's above it, right? He can see the whole picture, but that what he's building is ultimately for good, an objective good. And that's the thing, is that God sees that there's an objective evil and objective right and wrong. So why would the defense that God would give of these actions be, I'm God, you don't get to question? He does pull that from time to time. But usually it's in a, let me explain to you why you couldn't understand, like Job. Everyone points to Job as God just saying, well, I'm God, you don't get to know what's happening. I would argue that's a very wrong interpretation of what's happening in Job. Because what does God actually do? He takes Job and he says, here's all of the reasons you trusted my decisions in the first place. That's all he's doing. He's like, let's look at all of these things out here. You don't understand what's happening to you. I get that. But you need to sometimes we need to just rely on, we wouldn't understand why. But that's not every answer. In fact, more often than not, God will tell us, hey, we're seeing that, I'm seeing this, this is what's happening. Let me explain it to you. So you understand, and we'll move on. So why doesn't he give that kind of a defense for the flood or for the cleansing of the Levant? And the answer is he does. It's there in the text. We know from the book of Jasher, the book of John. Now, again, the book of Jasher is a medieval fraudulent book. However, it is based on older legends. What they did was, it was a fraudulent book, but it was written by a group of Jewish rabbis in Spain, and then it was published fraudulently as the book of Jasher. But what they did was they took a lot of oral history and put it together. So don't use it as scripture, don't use it as much of anything. But there are interesting things that pop up in other writings. It's like, okay, what it's doing is it's supporting certain mythologies and certain thoughts. But we see in the book of the giants, the book of Noah, a few others, that it wasn't just that the sons of God created the Nephilim with the children of women. They were also, particularly the Nephilim, were teaching humans to corrupt the DNA of animals, right? They were creating, some have argued this is the origin of the monsters, these chimeric creatures where it's like they're human, but they're not at the same time. Or some have, some are even more bizarre. So the argument is that it is their interference and that they taught humans to do the same thing. Well, if that's the case, and so if that's what's happening pre-flood, right? And God's like, whoa, we can't do this or everything's going to be corrupted. In fact, a lot of people have pointed out that when it says that Noah was perfect in his generation, that word is the same word used for the sacrificial lambs, that they were unblemished, right? And so a lot of people have taken that to mean it's not just that he was spiritually righteous, but that he was genetically pure as well, that he was not corrupted by the genetics of the time, that he fit both, right? He was both a righteous man, and his genes were clean, his family's genes were clean, so that's why he gets saved. And it's to wipe out all of these other things going on, right? That wasn't just humanity that had been corrupted, but the animals as well. Well, then we see it again in Sodom and Gomorrah, right? I think if you really read into Sodom and Gomorrah, there's a lot going on there. But I will argue personally that Sodom and Gomorrah is very much about them trying to recreate the Nephilim. Because think about it. If you look at a lot of the other writings about Sodom and Gomorrah, it focuses more on how unfriendly they were. They weren't charitable. They were actually sort of anti-charity. They really actually, outside of the fact that they were just engaging in like whole citywide orgies, they were actually, one of their pastimes was terrorizing homeless and poor people. Like if you were poor and you came there, they would literally starve you to death by giving you gold, and then you couldn't buy anything. And there was a woman who actually supposedly saved a man's life by feeding him. They took her, and she was one of their own. She was a sodomite, and they took her to the center, strapped her down, and basically starved her to death. Like these were not pleasant people. These were some very evil people. But why does Lot move there? Because it's prosperous. He's got a lot of cattle. He's prosperous, so they're happy to let him in. But why? So here's the problem. Everyone says, well, the men wanted to lie with the two angels that are sent there to Lot to get them out so God can be like, I'm nuking this place. You need to be somewhere else. Why does they want to lay with them specifically? Because if it was just, well, hey, it's somebody new, we're just going to go gang rape them. I don't know about you, but that's one of the stories that gets around. So I can't imagine Lot being like, oh, I want to go to that town where I'm going to get gang raped, and then we can be prosperous. No, I don't think so. However, I think they recognized the angels for what they were. I think what they were trying to do was recreate the Nephilim. I think that's, and we see that. I think they were trying to redo what happened at the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel was also an attempt to recreate the Nephilim, and it was successful. But I think we see that with Sodom and Gomorrah. Jude even equates the two. He's like, Sodom and Gomorrah, the angels that fell, same thing. So I think we see that there. But then also when we get to the cleansing of the Levant, when the Jews are returning from Egypt, right? What do we have? They are told there were certain tribes that they absolutely could intermarry with, they could make peace treaties with. It was kosher. Then there were these other tribes. They're like, you have to kill all of them. You can't take the flocks. You can't take their food. You can't intermarry. You have to destroy them. And there were, however, by the way, of these tribes that were to be destroyed, these cities that were to be destroyed, there was an allowance for unmarried, basically virgin women to be saved. Now, a lot of people have said, that's because they're taking war trophies. Not necessarily. There's a word that's ascribed to them that's usually used for nuns. So it's like they can be allowed to live because they're not dangerous. They won't do anything dangerous. But it was to try and spare someone. But the thing is, and there's even some arguments that maybe they weren't all killed off because it was hyperbolic language. But let's just take it as they killed everything. All of the tribes that they were told to kill everything, including the goats, right? Remember, there's that story where one guy is like, hey, I'm going to take a bunch of these goats and put them in my flock. They kill, and they stone the man, and they stone all of his goats, not just the ones that they took, all of them, to make certain that there was nothing that was corrupted. Why? They were all Nephilim tribes. All of the tribes and all the locations that they're like, you have to kill all of these things. They're all Nephilim. It's the Anakim, the Zanzumim, All of them are Nephilim tribes. Well, then that changes the nature of what's happening, right? It isn't, oh, here's a bunch of people who are where we want to be. Let's just push them off the land. It's these creatures are here to prevent us from doing what we need to do, which is to be the culture that brings about the Messiah. If these giants are allowed to stay, and by the way, some of them did, they absolutely did not do their job, which is why we have Goliath showing up later. A lot of giants absolutely left the Levant. They went north. This is why we have stories like Jack the Giant Slayer in Europe. We have Jotunheim. We have, or the Jutons, which are supposed to come from Jotunheim. Then we have stories of them taking reed boats to South America, to North America, where they show up in their mythologies. So, and in their histories. So what Joshua was doing was trying to remove the Nephilim influence, which is why they had to kill the animals. The Nephilim were manipulating their genetics as well. Why is that important? The practice of the Jewish people, the sacrifices, all of it was a type and shadow of Jesus. It was so that we would understand what Jesus did when he got here and did what he did. Everything that happens to Jesus is reflected in their practices. Even, in fact, this is one of those things. It's one of my favorite little points to really drive home. Because not only was was his death on the cross occurring at the same time that the Passover lamb was sacrificed in the temple, right? One of the first acts for the scapegoat is that the priests would. This is how you do the priestly blessing. This is why, in fact, just so little Star Trek thing. Leonard Nimoy and Shatner both Jewish, and Leonard Nimoy, the whole live long and prosper thing, doing this, that was his idea because he's like, wouldn't it be cool if it's actually a blessing? They would take the palms of their hands like this. They would lay it on the head, right? The priest would take it on the head of the sheep that was being cast, or the goat was being cast out to Azazel to put the sin on it, and they would proclaim the sin of Israel. That's what they would do. And then it was cast out to Azazel. At Jesus' trial, which, by the way, he has to kind of move along because they actually were screwing it up. If you ever want to understand how much God has to do to get us saved, and it's really all of him, it's that scene. Because it's a kangaroo court that was designed to get him executed, and they were screwing it up. And Jesus is over here like, seriously, I got to do everything for you people. Fine. I'm God. Are you good now? Are we ready to get this moving on? Because I'm kind of tired of just hanging around waiting for you people to do your job. So they then, after he goes through all that, what does it say that they do? It says they take their hands and they slam, and they're slamming their fists, or the palms of their hands, into his face, claiming that he is a blasphemer. Okay, why is that important? Ultimately, all sin is blasphemy. All sin sin is doing something. The easiest way, it's not just missing the mark. That's a Greek word. But the idea of sin is that you have chosen right and wrong for yourself, and you are doing what you believe is good, not what God says is good. That is blasphemy. Again, all throughout the Old Testament, what it was, the phrase that was used to let you know things had gone off the rails. It was that every man did what was right in his own eyes. That was the key. That's how you knew everything was off the rails, because that's blasphemy. It is rejecting God and God's truth and putting your will and your preferences in his place. So when they're slamming their palms into his head, proclaiming him to be a blasphemer, they're actually putting all the sin of humanity on him as the scapegoat. All of the feasts, all of the things of the Old Testament were designed to let us understand what Jesus was doing. Why is that important? Because what would have happened if a Nephilim polluted goat or sheep or bull made it onto the altar? Remember, the mercy seat, where the blood of those animals were sprinkled by the high priests in the Holy of Holies on the Ark of the Covenant, which had to be protected because the Shekinah glory of God itself, or Himself, sat on it. Like it wasn't just, oh, there's a box. There was a blue glowing flame that sat on it, and it left the temple, by the way. That's how a lot of Christians knew to get out of Jerusalem, was that it's recorded by Josephus and in the Talmud that the Shekinah glory left the temple and literally just very slowly left the temple, went through the streets and exited out the gate and just left. Like it opened the doors and left in front of everybody. It's fully recorded. The Shekinah glory would sit on the mercy seat. The animals had to be pure because they were symbolic. They were symbolic of Jesus Himself. We see that when Aaron's sons, right, they go and they get this other stuff, and they were using the wrong incense. God killed them. He's like, no, I told you what to do, and you didn't do it. You don't get to bring that here, right? He's too holy. It is His holiness that when you affront Him, must be. It's like you can't, right? He's going to. It's going to end up in you being destroyed. That's why the high priest wore bells with a rope tied around their legs. Anytime they walked in on the one day when they were to sprinkle the blood, because if something went wrong, if they weren't right, if they had maybe done something, God would have killed them, because it's like my holiness kills you, and they would have drug him out. What would have happened if not just the Nephilim were allowed to stay, but their manipulation of the goats, and had gotten into their flocks? What would have happened? The entire history of the Jewish people was to get us to Jesus so that humanity could be saved. The Nephilim are fifth columnists. They are creatures born of evil and human flesh, so they can operate freely on our side of the veil, right? Demons, spirits, even angels need permission to come here. Angels get it from God. But we even have the ability to say, hey, angels, I need your help here. But sometimes they can't even interact with you unless you give them that permission, right? Because you have to call them, because we have responsibilities. But they have rules they have to follow. Same thing with demons. This is why they possess people, because they can't interact with the physical world without some sort of physical conduit. Also, we need to grant them, as humans, authority to interact in our world. This is why magic spells are a thing. This is why shamanic drugs are a thing, so that we can reach out to them and bring them over. But the Nephilim, they don't have that requirement because they're physical beings. They are amphibious in a way. They can exist in our universe because they are born of human women. They have that right. When they die, they just don't go to Sheol like our spirits do. They wander the earth, right? As disembodied spirits, ghosts, demons, things like that. So the reason the Levant had to be cleansed wasn't just because God was like, look at these evil people doing evil things, though that is true. It was, these creatures are there to prevent you from doing what you need to do to save humanity. If they could prevent the coming of Jesus, then there is no salvation for any human. All humans are condemned to hell, because there's no way to save anybody. The blood had to be shed. It had to be perfect blood. It had to be Jesus. It had to be His sacrifice. That's why the Nephilim are important, to understand. They were our tyrants. They created our cultures. The ancient astronaut theory is right in this one regard, that all of our cultures are influenced by these non-terrestrial beings interfering in our reality, and that our initial cultures were sparked and created by their offspring, these hybridized offspring. All of that's true. It's just they weren't from another planet. They were from another dimension. They were interdimensional beings that are what we consider to be evil because they're demons. They're created beings. They're fallen angels. They are trying to prevent, and what Satan's trying to prevent ultimately is his casting into hell. He doesn't want us to be with God. That's the only real damage he can do, God, is to keep us from him, right? Because he loves us. He created us to be loved by him and for us to love him as well. If he can prevent that from happening, God's a being of infinite love. How much do you think it kills him when one of his loved creations has to be cast into hell because they reject his forgiveness? I would imagine that would be an infinitely painful thing, which is why he did everything he's done, which is why he sacrificed his own son, which is why his own son endured the pain of death and separation from himself. Remember, God is a triune being. God literally ripped one of his own aspects out of him and rejected it and threw it into Sheol to save us. That's what he did. We have to understand that the entire Bible is about him restoring us to him, right? And also conversely, Satan's attempts to prevent that. That's why all throughout the Old Testament, someone is always trying to kill the Jews, right? Someone's always trying to destroy them into this day. That is why, for all of the claims of anti-racism, who is it that is allowed to be racially profiled and oppressed? It's still the Jewish people. Anti-Semitic attacks are happening all over the world, and here. In fact, there was I think his name Ami Horowitz. There's a rise of anti-Semitic attacks in New Jersey or Brooklyn. Well, I think it's Brooklyn. He actually went around and started asking, "It's like, what's going on? Why?" And they all said, "Well, the Jews run the banks. The Jews own everything. So we're just going to beat them up." Like, every person said that. All of them. Anti-Semitism is on the rise. Why? Because Satan hates the Jews. Because he knows that there are still promises to the Jews to be fulfilled. Satan, if he can stop that, then he can make God a liar. God's not going to be defeated. Rest assured, we already know, we've read the end of the book. It's what we're studying on our Thursday shows, right? It's the end of the book. We know how it ends. Satan still thinks he can win. I don't get that, but that's between him and God. So to sum up, a lot of conversation here. The Nephilim were giants. They were hybrids. They existed to destroy the potential coming of the Messiah by polluting our genome and the genome of the animals as a backup. They were here to pervert and to corrupt everything so that none of us could be redeemed. That's it. It was to condemn all of humanity and the entire planet forever. That is why they were the enemies of the Jews. That's why they had to be destroyed. Any good doctor will look at a cancer and remove it. And no matter what, sometimes it takes radical surgeries. If something is gangrenous, that limb is removed to save the rest of the rest of the body. In the same way, these creatures were gangrenous, cancerous phenomena that corrupted both our morality and our genetics. We are going to come back to these creatures on our Thursday night study for a couple of times. I think this is absolutely connected to the Antichrist. I think this is absolutely connected to the false prophet. I think this is absolutely connected to at least one version of the mark of the beast. This is not something that only happened thousands of years ago. It is happening today. It will happen tomorrow. The combining of human and animal DNA, that's what was going on pre-flood. The creation of a hybrid race, what do you think the abduction phenomena is about? As it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be at the coming of the Son of God, or Son of Man. Jesus told us that what was happening while Noah was kicking around, all that pre-flood stuff, it's coming back. And more importantly, Noah was around when Nimrod was around. I think we often forget that. The days of Noah were not just pre-flood, although I think that's clearly the impetus, right? That's clearly what we're supposed to take from it, is the pre-flood world. But let's remember, him and Nimrod were there. We're talking about this more. I think we'll talk about this more next week. The relationship between Nimrod and uh, and Noah, because I think there's a lot of there, and that'll also help us with the Thursday night as well. So I've gone almost over 40 minutes over this. If you're still here, thank you for putting up with me. Unfortunately, this was one of those thoughts where it's like I could have ended it earlier, but I'm like, but then we're gonna miss all the really good stuff. Like, why was it important, right? Why was why did they need to be destroyed? Why is God not this capricious, malevolent creature, but rather a very caring and loving father who is overseeing his creations, but is actively working to prevent their corruption, right? Any good father, I have got 3 kids. If I knew, right, it's like, hey, those kids over there are going to get you into drugs and crime and destroy your life, I wouldn't let them hang out with them, right? I do everything possible. Same thing, right? So these creatures are unbelievably evil. Their goals are the damnation of all of humanity. Luckily, that can't happen anymore. Jesus took care of it. That being said, we're coming to a time where these things are going to become much more prevalent. We're seeing them. We're coming to that time. If we're not in it already, it's coming within the next 7 years. And we'll talk about that more when we get to Revelation 12. But the point is, the Nephilim are important to understanding the beginning of the book and the end of the book, because the middle of the book is what's important. I will see y'all on Thursday. I want y'all to pray for one another, love one another, be with the people that are around you, work with the people that you are around and with, the communities that you're in, because the harvest is ripe. I think if you want to save the country, you need to work on saving your community first. Be that light. We're going to be doing some more things, and I hope, and like I said, as I clear a few things off, we're going to do some more Saturday. We won't do necessarily Saturdays as a live show all the time. A lot of it's going to be recorded. Like, I'm going to do a full creationism thing, since talking about that seems to make everything get wonky. But we're also going to talk about some other things, like how should Christians approach politics, and even sort of addressing the chaos that we're seeing. What is it that how should we respond to all the chaos that we're seeing? What is the origin? How do we proceed forward? Because I think that the church, as I've said on that one Thursday show a couple weeks ago, I think the church has gotten a lot wrong, and we are being told to get out of it, and we need to move forward. We need to be the adults in the room, and we also need to fight for what's really, truly right in both our own personal lives and in the world in which we live, because God wants us to bless those around us. So until then, Thursday night, I'll see y'all there. We're going to talk more about Revelation. What chapter are we in now? I just forgot. This is why I write everything down. Yeah, so we're going to talk about chapter 9. We stopped with the locusts, and we're going to get into the 6th, and at least the 6th trumpet, and we're going to get into chapter 10 definitely, because there's some really interesting things. I don't know how far we'll get into chapter 10, but we'll do at least the 6th trumpet, and then the section where John eats the little book. Until then, be good to one another. For those of you who want more of this, less serious, but maybe have a little bit more fun, I will be on with Daniela, which is AKA Hidden Existence, later this evening. I'll see y'all later. I gotta find a better way to end these broadcasts, because it's like, I know it's like, hey, you hit the broadcast, it's like, are you sure? You sure you want to end it? Yeah, I know. And I'm over here clicking all the things. You're like, why is he just staring at the screen? I'm trying to leave. I really am. All right, guys. We'll talk at y'all later.